So who am I? What am I doing here? I'm a developer at Jump24. I work with Laravel, take PHP using test-driven development. My Twitter handle's there, my email's there, personal website and company website. We're currently hiring for a couple of roles, a full stack developer and a PHP developer. So if anybody's looking or knows anybody that is, feel free to look at our site. So why do we need standards? We have a heck of a lot of systems we use. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. We've got Docker, Terraform, AWS, PHP, Nginx, Laravel, Inertia, React, Sass, MySQL, Redis, HTML5, CSS3, plain JavaScript and Webpack. All of those together generally go to making up an application that we build. So key takeaway from this is going to be standards help. They enable developers to work together better, simplifies code review and keeps consistent across projects. So a developer can work on any project within the company and know that the standards are going to be applied universally. We're going to focus on PHP because we're a PHP group. They're our centerpiece. We use linter, ECS, Phpstorm, Enlightenment, and tests. I'm not really going to cover tests today, but suffice it to say we use test-driven development, and the key thing is that unless the tests are passing, we don't commit it. Everything we do, we think in terms of hit by a bus scenario. So if I was hit by a bus tomorrow, could somebody else pick up the work? So what's linter? It's not just about making it pretty. It's about solving code errors. So catching those things that really annoy us, like missing semicolons or functions that are incorrectly named. So a bad code example for linting would be something like this. At first glance, kind of looks okay, but actually there's a few errors there. So linter, we'd run the code, it'd show us fairly plain error messages that there's a parse error, and that's the code failing to execute. So let's bring in some packages. Let's bring in console highlighter and parallel lint, and then add a script for linting. So now we get to run that, and it gives us a much clearer message. It tells us where the error is, it tells us what the error is, and it gives us some nice pretty colors, because I don't know about you, I find it much easier to look at something that's red and know that's a problem, and if it's green, it's not. So fixing the code in this case, dead easy. There's a couple of missing semicolons, and I wasn't actually calling the function, it was doing nothing. So we added the semicolon at the end of the constant and a semicolon at the end of my message, and then ran the function, echo me else. Run it again, and it works. That is probably the most simple form of standards that we'll implement. It just catches those little errors that can annoy you. Sometimes these things will be highlighted in the different IDEs that we can use. We use Phpstorm. So in Phpstorm, we get some pretty great error reporting built in. We use standard packages that we've developed. We start to enforce our own particular coding style using these packages. So these are publicly available on Packagist, so you can import our standards packages and just use them. Instructions are there to detail how to do that. Jump24 is the route for the packages, and there's 2 packages we use. We bring in all 4 packages, PHP coding standards, the project analyzers, and then the 2 we brought in previously. And we've set up a few scripts. So we mainly work in Laravel. So in this case, the test uses artisan test, but that could be any command that you use to run the tests. Lint would run linting, ECS runs ECS, static would run Phpstorm, and analyze would run Enlightenment. We'd set up a Phpstorm file. This is all just basic config that we do at the very start of any new project or when we're bringing in the standards to a project. We'd import our own Phpstorm file from the package. We'd create a Phpstorm baseline that's blank, and we'd exclude the vendor paths and a couple of specific files. That's pretty much the base setup we have for Phpstorm. The rest of the hard work's actually done in that file. ECS, I'm going to cover in a bit more depth in a minute, but ECS requires its own setup. This is a fairly simple setup. Since I actually wrote this talk, there's been a deprecated function, so this isn't quite right now. I need to make a change to the container configurator. So it just gives a deprecation warning on parameters set. And publish the Enlightenment config. And just add in Enlightenment path to the analyzer space path. That's pretty much all of the configuration, and all of that's described in the packages that are available. So what are we using here? Linting, static analysis, coding standards, security, consistency, and efficiency checks. Why linting? As I said, it highlights code errors. Why ECS? It allows us to ensure our standards for code are met, extending this easily, and it allows for easier in-editor highlighting of our custom standards. So if we're beginning to write our standards, it helps us to write those with clearer in editor editing. The other thing is that, quite honestly, I don't write like XML, and I much prefer writing PHP because I understand PHP and don't really like XML. So with ECS, you write in PHP rather than XML. What standards do we apply with that? We'll use PSR12 and a few related other standards. Some of them are external standards such as Squiz Labs, and some of our own. Why do we use Phpstorm? Firstly, it integrates better with Laravel. Secondly, it integrates better with Phpstorm. It allows us to run static analysis and helps to strengthen our code for consistency across projects. There are other alternatives, but for us, we chose Phpstorm because it just fits better to our particular code base. Why Enlighten? This is a relatively new package. It analyzes Laravel specifically for security, consistency, performance, and maintainability. It's easily extendable. So again, you can add your own extra checks to it if you need to. Things around security, it would highlight out-of-date packages. It will highlight packages that are not on a stable release. It would pick up on one of our custom ones is that Tinker is installed. We'll remove that just so that it can never ever be released to production. Consistency, one of our custom ones is invokable controllers in Laravel. We do that because we like to use invokable controllers, makes it easier for us to go to a single controller and know that that code is doing one particular thing, keeps the controllers nice and slim. So yes, you might end up with 10 different files for a post, for example, but you know that if you go to the post save controller, then that's exactly what it's doing, and it's not trying to create a post, save a post, update a post, delete a post. So at this point, let's have a quick look at a little app that I wrote, showing my amazing front-end skills. I wrote a blogging app. So as you can see, this is working. We have a test post. I can go to the post, see the post there. I can leave comments and it will leave comments there. I can add posts. So it's working, it's there. But what do the standards packages actually have to say about this? If I bring over Phpstorm, first one we had was lint. So let's have a look at what lint says. I'm kind of hoping this passes first time. There we go. So that runs across all of the files, tells us 93 files were checked and nothing was found. So we're okay with linting, there's no code errors, but we could see that by the fact it was working in the browser. So let's take a look at the next one. So the one after lint, we'd normally run ECS next. So let's run Composer and ECS. Let's see what ECS thinks about this code. And this is that deprecation I was mentioning earlier. It's highlighted that there's a problem with one of the commands. I just need to change that out to the new setup. So this has picked up on quite a few different errors here. In fact, if we look at the bottom, it tells us that there's 4 errors that need to be fixed manually and 21 that could be automatically fixed. So let's take a quick look right at the top and have a look at the first error it highlights. So that one's in kernel. In this instance, we won't worry about that. That's an internal one. Handlers internal. Register controllers an internal. Home controller. So in home controller, it's telling us that there's a problem here. And it's telling us that there's an unused use. So let's take a look at the home controller and see what it's talking about. So here's the home controller. And in this case, it's actually highlighted it in Phpstorm, but ECS has also picked it up. In this case, the issue is as simple as that use statement doesn't need to be there because request isn't used in this at all. So we could just delete that. Post controller, it's again telling us that there's a few things here, all in post controller. So there's quite a few errors it's picked up here. And as you can see, it's actually suggesting diffs for changing the code to something that better suits the standards we apply. So it's actually wanting to change a heck of a lot in this controller. So it's telling us that there's a missing space after close, missing space after parentheses, space after keyword, empty comments. So let's have a look at this post controller. So in the post controller, at the moment, I've got a fair few functions here. And well, the first thing we can notice is on this occasion, there's no unused uses, but it was highlighting several errors in this. So the first one is in show. So if I go to show, you can see that this code is actually valid code. There's nothing wrong in principle with this code because it runs, it works. But what it's telling us is that they're incorrect. So we need to move the bracket back up and we need a space between if and the bracket there. Normally, we'd also have a few extra line spacing to make things easier to understand. In this case, it does actually fall between each function, but sometimes they're related. A lot of this is more about making code easier to understand. So it mentioned earlier that there was some that we could fix. ECS has a built-in fixer. Just by adding --fix, we can run that again. So it's only been ECS check fix. So if we run that again, it will actually fix 21 of the errors that it found. But it still leaves us with 4 that it thinks that we need to take a look at. So you've got the kernel has an unused parameter schedule, the handler has an unused parameter E, public method name user can post. is not in camel case. So looking at the user, that's basically just telling us that this function should be written as that, and this one will also be written as that. So at this point, I'm not going to apply those changes because there's several places that those functions are used. So ECS's main principle here is to help us to apply coding standards such as PSR 12. And as I say, some of the custom ones that we've written ourselves. So the next one that we'd normally run is analyze. So we, static. So we'd allow Phpstorm to take a look at our code. Let's see what Phpstorm has to say about this. There's 31 files that Phpstorm wants to take a look at. And again, it's giving us a lot of errors here, 49 of them to be precise. So things like, we're in the user over here, so let's take a look. User posts has no type hint defined. So for us, type hints are helpful. It maintains consistency on what we're returning, because at the moment we could literally return anything we want from this function and it would quite happily return that, but it may not be what we want to use in the using it. So we could apply the return type on that, which would solve the error on line 33. The other one that we get quite often is construct empty is not allowed. So let's have a look at redirect if authenticated and line 22. So in this case, it's saying, is guards empty? If it is, return an array with null, otherwise return guards. So there's nothing actually wrong with that code because it checks that guards is empty. But empty will allow a lot of things to pass through. So an empty string would pass through empty, null would pass through empty, undefined, I believe, does. So what we normally do would be change it to a stronger check. So something like count guards is 0. If it is, return null. If it's not, return guards. So this is telling us that the new type of array is not matching. So this is where Phpstorm is telling us something in the editor. This is where Phpstorm excels in highlighting to us simple little things that we may not have thought of at the time of writing that line of code. Some could think again about that line and look at it. So authenticate, redirect to should be returning something but isn't. This is another error that we often see. So here we have, if it expects JSON, return root login, which returns a string, but we actually have it doing nothing if it is JSON. So we could do return null, which would resolve that error because it now returns at all possible points rather than just allowing it to pass through the function. Now here's one that has a lot of problems in a single controller, which is the post controller. If I go back to the post controller, line 12, no type hint specified. So here we have a return statement here, but we haven't said what we're returning. So we just press on the return type, which would resolve that. Dynamic call to static method. So with post is static, but we're calling it dynamically. In this instance, Phpstorm may actually have this wrong, but we could use the static call. What we can do, however, is let's assume that we've applied this on a old code base that has a lot of errors. What we could do is we can take advantage of the create baseline. Sorry, it's generate baseline. So we generate a baseline. And what this does is it runs Phpstorm. And once it's completed, it actually saves the errors that it has in the baseline file and tells it to ignore these particular errors. So let's assume that we've said it's okay. We know these problems are here. And if I run composer again, sorry, we run this again, Phpstorm will come back and say there are no errors. The reason being it's been told to ignore them. This can be useful when there are errors that either aren't errors, so errors that are just getting it wrong, or where there are errors that are out of scope of what you're working on to fix, or for example, where you may need to speak to the customer about potential fixes that will require extra work to resolve. So that's static. Now let's take a look at Enlighten. So Enlighten, as I said, is specifically tailored to Laravel. So let's see what Enlighten does. So it runs through. It takes a few minutes because it does a heck of a lot of checks against this. And as it goes through, it will highlight errors and give you a nice pretty table as soon as it's done the last one that tells you exactly what was applied. So it tells us that 36 were passing, 7 failed, 4 weren't applicable, and there's 1 error. But it also gives us a breakdown of exactly what it's telling us is wrong. So check 48, your application does not include Tinker in production, fail. So in our case, we don't want Tinker to make its way to production because it allows, if the server is compromised, allows for basically anything to be done in code. So all we do in that instance would be remove Tinker completely. We don't use it in our development, so we could just remove it. The other alternative would be to set up a separate deployment system for production and development, but that in itself poses other risks. In this case, dependencies are up to date. If you get dependencies on dependency up to date failed, that could be as simple as an update to a package has been released that would fit in with the setup that you have in Composer, and it would highlight that a package has been updated. Basically, the solution for that one is always just run Composer update. The way it does the checks here are quite interesting. So up to date would check for Composer update, but uses stable versions. This will look at how Composer is pulling in those updates. So in this instance, it's telling us that there is an out-of-date dependency, and the out-of-date dependency, I can tell you straight off, is going to actually be our coding standards. There's a new version of the package that we've brought in because we're just in the process of making this standard package available to both Laravel and Cake PHP, so we've had to separate them out. and we've created a new version. So it's telling us that that's out of date. If I updated that to 1.0.0, it would quite happily pass that test. So your application includes logging, throttling for protection against brute force attacks. That's not applicable because we're not using authentication in this app. Front-end dependencies with known security issues, again, not applicable because the front end doesn't pull in via npm anything that it shouldn't be pulling in, and it doesn't change anything. Your application contains an NVMRC. So this is one that we apply to Laravel projects simply because npm is used as part of the Laravel front-end build. An NVMRC file will basically define the exact version of Node and npm that you wish to use. It tells you exactly there how to create it, which would be node v to NVMRC. By doing that, you'd resolve this error, and NVMRC, you could then use NVM to, across the developers, across the projects, keep up to date with the version of npm at that specific time. So we had a fair few passing here. Your application does not use invalid return types, passed. So there was nothing in there that was the wrong return type. So cache prefix is set to avoid collisions with other apps. Imagine the scenario that you have a server with 2 or 3 different applications running on it, and that server shares a Redis instance. By defining a cache prefix, you can ensure that no 2 applications would clash so long as those prefixes are different. So what we'd normally do is we just have the prefix as simple as the name of the application. So if your application is called Amazing Blog, we have Amazing Blog _ as the cache prefix. Your application does not contain unused global middleware. This one is a very small enhancement to performance, but effectively by removing middleware from the stack that isn't used, you're making the amount of code in memory at the time of the request being created smaller, so your application will run quicker, it has less to process. So target class user driver doesn't exist. That's an interesting one. So that's actually a code error that I've got somewhere that's caused a crash here with an exception. A proper session driver would normally highlight that you are not using a singular session based on the computer, but would use something like MySQL, Redis, anything that is not located on the individual server and can be shared across services. The same with the queue driver. It would normally suggest Redis. At the moment, it would be set to synchronous, which would mean it'd process the queue as soon as it's dispatched. By pushing off to Redis, it will improve performance of the application by ensuring that the queue is handled correctly, and that it would use, it will also highlight whether Horizon is installed, which is another Laravel application, to assist in keeping that queue under control. In fact, it's there, check 5. So we're not using the Redis queue because it's told us that, so this check isn't applicable. But if this was Redis queue, it'd run this check as well. The other one that I mentioned was the invokable single action controllers. So going back to that rather large controller of the post controller, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different functions in this controller. That means that for this post controller, you've got 7 different sets of code happening all at once in the controller, making it more complex to find what it is that is broken. So what we would normally do is we would have a index controller, for example, and we just have invoke as the only function and build up more controllers for each individual action. So it improves maintainability, can help with improving testability, and it also helps with being able to point to problems in code quicker. So for example, let's say that you have a 1,000-line controller that is doing basically everything in the application, and you have a problem somewhere in the middle of that. How do you know which of the 1,000 lines it is? Whereas if you've got a controller that is basically 10 lines long, so your use statements and a single function, you're going to know that the error is in that particular function. So the other thing that you can do with Enlighten is also able to create a baseline if any of these tests fail and are not relevant to your particular setup. For example, it's highlighting to you that the queue driver isn't set to Redis, but you're not using queues. You can ignore that error. So combining all of these together, we have recently applied standards to a application, and just by applying these standards, allowing Phpstorm to suggest the changes, we saw roughly a 20% increase in efficiency in that application just by applying these standards. And it surprised most of us that this was even possible just by changing slightly how things were written. So things like fail fast, if it's going to have an error in the process, make that the first thing it does, rather than have the success as the first thing it does. So by that, you would have if user is null, for example, as the first test, rather than if user, then do, else do something else. It also simplifies the stacking of code by doing that. So for us, standards are central to how we work. It simplifies our code review as well, because before we applied our standards packages, we were spending most of our time on code review going, you need an extra line here, you missing a semicolon here, you've got an if statement here that's not laid out right, you've got no return type on this. Nowadays, we're spending more time looking at the logic of the code and whether that logic is correct above looking at how the code is laid out. So what I would normally do if I set this up is I would actually have a single script that I would run at the end that would run everything, and I'd have the tests on the end of it. So before I push, I'll run composer before push. Based on Sebastian's talk, I think we can probably change that now to a hook. But by having all of these before push and not pushing if it's broken, it makes everybody's life easier. Using the fixes, using the baselines if they're necessary also helps. The key thing for me with the standards and baselines is if you think there is an error that is wrong, check with somebody else as well. So I will speak to other developers in the company. If I have an error that looks wrong and it's highlighting something that I don't quite understand, I will go and talk to one of the other developers. They'll take a look at it and we'll come to an agreement whether that's one that we should be ignoring or whether there is actually a fix that's possible in the scope of the work that we have at the time. So that's an exceedingly brief overview of our standards. So there's more. That isn't the only standards that we apply. We have standards on pretty much every single part of our stack. Over time, they've evolved not just to cover code, but how we estimate, how we present things to clients, how we manage our projects, and pretty much every other part of the business. And over time, we expect these to continue evolving, and it's not a fixed point to say that these are the standards forever. We have over time applied further standards, even since beginning this package, and begun to separate out to allow further frameworks to be used. So I'm going to throw open to questions.
Just having a look in the chat. There have been some discussions about missing iterable type values. Let's see. Yeah, I can't see any questions. Anybody? Yeah, I like the generate baseline option PHP. So I found that last week. I was pairing with somebody, so I like that much better than editing the file by hand.
Yeah, generate baseline can be helpful. It's just making sure that you're only applying it when you sort of got the errors left that you want to be applied. I've done it before where I've applied it and actually Phpstorm was pointing out a breaking error. It was one that would have thrown an exception, but I missed it in the setup and noticed that it was in the file at the end, and so I removed it from the baseline and then went and changed that function.
Yeah, most of mine seem to be because of iterable types, either in the type int or the return type. So being able to set that to false, which I saw in the neon file, would be quite useful. So I'm going to dig into that later on. Does anybody have any questions? Either in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask if you
so Daniel Leach commented that SARM links directly to the docs. Phpstorm does for some of them, not all of them.
Okay.
We did actually look at SARM as an option when we were setting up the standards, and decided that for us, Stan was a better fit. There's nothing wrong with SARM. It's another perfectly viable solution, and it does have many things that Stan doesn't, and it's just the way that we have things set up. Stan fits better for us.
I have a question about Rector, which worked quite well with Phpstorm, but I could never ever get it working with a Laravel project. I was just wondering if you've experimented at all using Rector to try and automatically fix some of this code. The Stan finds.
I haven't since being at Jump 24, but I have seen it used. I know it's possible to do it. My Twitter handle will be available on any of the tweets that have gone out. Drop me a message. I can speak to one of the guys in our company. He may well have the answer on how it's sorted.
Yeah, that baseline is going to be useful as well. Thank you for that.
Baseline is a lifesaver.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to take a look at that PHP into parallel package as well. So now I've seen that in some of our composer files where we're sort of running PHP -L or something, or one of those sort of options. But it seems a bit, yeah, you sort of run that, then we've got the configuration isn't as clean as what we saw there. So I'll have a look at that as well.
Yeah,
I think the output of it was quite nice. So I'll look into that.
Parallel linter is also running multiple processes at once, hence parallel. So yeah. on a bigger project, we've got one that's an absolutely massive code base. I think it's something like 15,000 files, and it will run over that in about 15 seconds.
Okay, I think I sort of exclude option as well, so you could sort of exclude test and exclude vendor or something. So yeah, I'll have a look at that later on.
Sebastian, I've just seen your
Sebastian,
comments
yeah.
about Enlighten and ECS. Enlighten is less than 18 months old. I'm not surprised you haven't heard of that one, but it's fast becoming recognized in the Laravel world. It's brilliant with the way that it gets set up. The version that I was using there was the free version. The pro version isn't that expensive. I can't remember its exact pricing, but it's not that expensive, and it adds even more than just the base checks.
Yeah, it looks really awesome. It really looks great. So
Yeah, when we discovered it, we loved it. The one that I really hated when it first came in was the one where it says upgrade the package, because I'd commit something and it'd tell me that there's a package out of date between the commit and it going there. But that also means that when it went to production, it would have been. So by Enlighten picking that up, it stops anything that's out of date making its way to production, assuming that you're not leaving weeks between commit and publish to prod.
Yeah, all very good stuff. Okay. Any more for question-wise? Anybody? I guess Twitter, probably, Chris, is the best place for people to get hold of you on.
Twitter or my email address. Email address is
Okay.
chris@jump24.co.uk, and that's 24.